sincerely seek Him. So faith is really like an essence of our relationship with God. For many people, faith, of course, is lived out in secret places, working through difficult experiences, whether it's grief or struggles or things that we can't express, but we're living on the edge of faith. We're clinging to it. For some of us, it's more public, being involved in different issues and programs, but faith is really that point of our belief meeting where the rubber meets the road. We do a lot of Bible studies. We have an apologetics Bible study on Tuesday nights. We have small groups. We have Sunday school classes. And in those, when I was in school, you were supposed to memorize the presents. You can Google it faster than I could say it if I had it memorized, Knowledge is everywhere, and so is biblical knowledge, what we can study and know about the Word. But faith is bringing that knowledge to an application and using it. I had a minister I served with in North Carolina, and he had spent some time in Vietnam near the end of the Vietnam War. And he was actually on the front lines fighting. And he was some kind of sergeant, but he wasn't a commissioned officer. And he would tell me stories about what it was like to be in foxholes and being shot at. And one of the stories he liked to use in reference to our church was this. He said, Mark, when we're in a foxhole and the enemy's shooting at us and bullets are whizzing, he said, you got these portable meals. He said, we would open them. He said, they all had mustard. And this guy would freak me out because he put mustard on everything. He said, all those packets had mustard. We would pour the mustard on whatever was in there. We didn't even read. We didn't even try to figure out what the mystery meat was. We covered it with mustard. We shoved it down as fast as we could because our goal was just to live. We just needed some calories to keep fighting, keep our heads down, and shoot. He said, we never complained about what was in those bags. We never even thought about it because everything was about the battle. He said there were a couple times they would give us a break and we'd go to the back, and some of you are old enough to remember the show MASH. It was kind of like that. They'd go to the back and they'd be in a place where the fighting wasn't. He said, you go to the mess hall and people were complaining, we have mashed potatoes again. They were complaining we didn't get enough ketchup. And he said, Mark, I kind of realized the same applies in our Christian walk. When we're in the front, when we're in the battle, when we're being involved in people's lives, we're not the people who are focusing on, the padded pews aren't padded enough. The carpet color's not the right color anymore. The kid is driving his bike across the grass and making a rut in our church grass. He said that when you're in the back, that's when you have time to start to really look at these things and complain. But when you're in the front and your faith is on the front line, you're thinking of the battle. And so he used to always use that as an example of what flying was like. You could perhaps show them a book of what flying looked like. You could tell them how God created their wings to give them the ability to fly. You could talk about what it's like to flap. You could talk what it's like to coast. But until you push them off the edge of the nest, they never know what flying is. Perhaps you had a dad like mine. The way we learned to swim, you either go down or you come up, right? But you learn. We learn, and our faith grows by application. Our knowledge can grow in Bible studies, but our faith really grows when we get out and we apply it. And so I have a picture that I think will show in here. It didn't show in the other room. And this is, I know it's hard to see from where you're sitting, but this is a picture of the Red Sea at biblical time, okay? And I think I even have a pointer, but I can't see it because of my color blindness. Okay, so now today the water goes, there's a Suez Canal, so there's water all the way. But in the biblical day, when they were coming out of Egypt, you could get to the promised land without ever going near the Red Sea. Now I want you to listen to how God worked this scenario as we start in Exodus 14, chapter 14, verse 1. And it says this, Then the Lord said to Moses, Tell the Israelites to turn back to Pi Hathor, directly opposite of Baal Zephon. Pharaoh will think that the Israelites, listen, he says Pharaoh will think that the Israelites are wandering around the land confused and hemmed in by the desert. So in essence, God could have said, hey, look, let's get away from Pharaoh as fast as we can, hug the coastline, and track out of here, right? Instead, what God says, hey, Moses, I want you to turn back. I want you to come down here to where one side of you is Egypt, one side of you is the desert, and the other side is the Red Sea. Now, that doesn't make sense, but that's how God works. So the next thing you know, they're boxed in. And the king of Egypt hears this, and it says that when Pharaoh knew that they were boxed in like that and that he realizes he's let all of his slaves go, which makes building pyramids hard, he decides, I better go after him. And he takes 600 of his best chariots along with some other troops, and they head off to get these Israelites back. It goes on to tell us in verse 10 that as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified, and they cried out. Now, the Egyptians probably got to them quicker because of the chariots. And they cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, why? Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to die in the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would be better to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. This is that moment, by the way, of getting near the edge of the nest. Moses answered the people in verse 13, and he says, don't be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, you will need only to be still. And then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on, rise up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, divide the water so the Israelites can cross on dry ground. Now, what a lot of us miss in this story, we don't think about, I think it's cool, and I just want to throw it in as honorable mention. It tells us, by the way, in there in verses 19-20, that the angel of the Lord who had been moving with the Israelites in front of them goes to the back of the line and stands between them and the Israelites, and the pillar of cloud that had been guiding them goes from the front of the column to the back of the column, and listen to what it does. On the Egyptian side, it puts out darkness, and on the Israel side, it puts out light, so that they are protected from the Egyptians, and they have the light they need in the dark to make their escape. And then it goes on in verse 21 to tell us this. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind, and he turned it into dry land. And the waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. God intentionally marched the Israelites to the Red Sea where they would be boxed in so their faith could grow. He could have easily gotten them out of there faster by going the straight route. But the straight route doesn't make your faith grow, and God needed the Israelites to grow in their faith. So first off, they saw God triumphed over Egypt in the 10 plagues. Now they're seeing God triumph over the Red Sea. What's going to happen soon is they're going to get out in the desert and complain again because they don't have food, and God's going to bring bread from heaven. But in each of these instances, don't you think God kind of is easily saying, hey, don't you remember the 10 plagues? And then when the water parts and they get in the desert and complain about food, don't you think he says, hey, don't you remember us to deeper faith steps? A friend of mine right now, he's in his 30s. He lost his job because he's missing too much time for his sickness, and he has 2 boys and he's divorced. My buddy is at the Red Sea. He is believing he needs to see some kind of miracle in his faith. And we're all praying for him, all of us who, we're all a friend group. He bought the book about the Red Sea faith, and after he read it, he brought it to me. This is the thing. Sometimes I hear people always say, I'm at the end. I can't, if it doesn't happen now, it's over. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen God work at that moment, that Red Sea experience. I want to tell you about a couple of illustrations today. The first is one of my favorite places in the world. It's the Village Project in Makutani, Kenya. It's outside of the bigger city is Eldoret, which is not really a bigger city, but it's where they have an airport. And in 2006, there was a lady called Mama Mary. I can't pronounce her last name, and it would be a shame to butcher it. Mama Mary was a widow, and she also had pastored, and she was really troubled by the amount of widows suffering in her area. And if you know the culture, the husband's family is supposed to take care of his widow, but they don't because they don't want to spend the money, and widows are suffering and oftentimes having to abandon their children because they can't feed them. And so Mama Mary started ministering to some widows, and next thing you know, they're bringing their kids, and she's kind of teaching the kids. And while this is happening, her son Davis is in Kenya, or in Nairobi, going to a school of theology, the Kimas International School of Theology. I think it's a Methodist-based school. And my friend Margaret Lewis was there working. She would go every year and volunteer in the summer while her husband did his continuing ed in the summer. He was a professor. Well, finally, Margaret's husband passed, and she was a widow. And she told me one time, she said, Mark, while I was in America, I was always full of grief. While I was in Africa, I didn't have grief. So I went to Africa. I was volunteering at this place. Davis talks to me about what his mom is doing. I go with Davis to see what his mom is doing. And in 2009, they launched the Village Project. The Village Project is a little community center with a clinic and a room where they teach women to sew with foot-powered machines, and they're selling their goods, and they're starting to buy like chickens and cows for their families and being able to support their families and not worry about how their deceased husband's family is treating them. And then they started with a school, and the school started with 50 kids, and today there's 1,200 kids. They got a deep water well, they've got solar power, they've got satellite internet, they've got computers, they've got an